The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society presents this recording from a live presentation on September 24th, 2024. Researching historical fiction explores the task of an author and editor's job in balancing research with good storytelling. Susan Wands is in conversation with authors Radha Vatsal and Faith Justice, and editor Andrea Robinson, to discuss making a compelling narrative while weaving in historical facts that make up the genre of historical fiction. A fascinating discussion for our writer and reader members alike. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website link listed in the description. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here tonight. I'm Susan Wands. I'm part of the steering committee here with the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society, and I'm so excited to have this panel with us tonight. I'm going to read you their bios so you know who they are. I'm going to start off with Faith Justice. Faith is on our steering committee, and Faith writes award-winning fiction and articles. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Her work appears in such publications as Salon.com, Writer's Digest, and the Copperfield Review. She is a past chair of the Historical Novel Society New York City chapter, and she is an associate editor for Space and Time magazine. Her most recent book is Rebel Empress, a novel of Imperial Rome. This is the third in the Theodosian Women series of biographical historical novels. For fun, Faith likes to dig in the dirt, either in her garden or various archaeological sites. Sample her work, check out her blog, ask her questions at her website, which is faithljustice.com, and she loves to hear from readers. Sitting right next to her is Andrea Robinson, developmental editor. She has spent over a decade as an acquiring editor at Penguin Random House, where she edited New York Times bestsellers, including Samantha Irby's We Are Never Meeting in Real Life, and Jennifer McMahon's The Winter People. Prior to that, she was on the editorial team at the Book of the Month Club. In 2016, she started her freelance editorial business, where historical fiction continues to be one of her favorite genres to edit. I was also very lucky because she edited one of my books. So she's one of my favorite editors ever. Radha Vatsal, is that how we pronounce it? Vatsal, thank you, is the author of A Front Page Affair and Murder Between the Lines, the first two novels in the Kitty Weeks mystery series set in World War I era New York. Her essays and stories have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Review of Books, the Smithsonian Magazine, Crime Reads, Kirkus Reviews, Brooklyn Rail, and elsewhere. Born and raised in Mumbai, India, Radha received her PhD from Duke University, where she studied Victorian literature and film history. Radha used to be fluent in Russian, which she studied at the House of Soviet Culture in Mumbai, then Bombay. She worked as a translator in the far east of Russia near the Russian-Chinese border. Then she loves paper ephemera, is that how you pronounce that? Yeah. Thank you. And is a tennis enthusiast. Her new novel, Number 10 Dower Street, will be published in March 2025. She lives and works in New York City. All right, I can't wait to ask these questions. The topic is researching historical fiction. And we have two fabulous historical fiction novelists, and we have an editor. So I'm going to start out with the first question to Andrea. Andrea, as a developmental editor, you've spent the last decade editing people's works. Can you tell us, when you first get a manuscript, how do you see your work as the editor balancing the story? Is it storytelling versus history lesson? What's your take on that?
So when I get a historical manuscript, I always consider the historical setting one prong of that we need to evaluate, the same way that we evaluate character, the same way we evaluate plot, the same way we evaluate pacing. Historical fiction has this added element of the history and the research and the reality that's behind it. But I just like to include it as one element of what I'm looking at, not that has equal weight with all of the others, because I feel like if you prioritize the history, then there's always the question of why aren't you writing nonfiction? Like, there's a reason that you want to get this history across as a novel, whether that's because you feel like people will feel the emotions of it, it's because you feel there's a really fascinating character that has been ignored by history that you want to highlight or bring new life to. There's a reason that you're working with this material as a novel. And so I think that it's very important to consider, all of the elements, but with the historical aspect as a really important key.
As you're working along in a novel, is there a certain point when you're reading it where you feel it jumps the rails from being a novel to being a history lesson?
I feel like when I lose connection with the character or the characters, like when I feel like the history is leading the characters as opposed to the character leading the history. Like sometimes people, they have this wonderful footnote of history, like this is such a dynamic era, and they want to get everything that was happening in the era across on the page, but then it becomes a situation where I feel like the character is just a pair of eyes that's being kind of led around by the nose so that she or he can see all of these fascinating things that were happening. And on one hand, a lot of there's a lot of richness to that. You get to see a good chance of the world, but you do feel a little bit like, okay, well, what is this character learning from this? Like, is this character a vehicle for the reader, or is this character a character that is existing within this world building? And so I used, when I was acquiring as an editor and things would come across my desk, there were so many projects that would make my, little editorial fox ears perk up, and I would get really excited, but I always felt like, okay, this is a book that's about the history. Like, the character is really what readers connect with at the beginning, like at the end of the day, that's what people are going to remember. And that's really how you can get the history you want to get across, is through this creation that you've made.
Good point. Faith, in your recent writing, which is the third in the Theodosian Women's series, Rebel Empress, I see that you're writing a whole series based on these women. Why were you drawn to that specific period of antiquity?
Well, I started with the characters, and my very first novel, historical novel, featured a woman named Hypatia, who was a philosopher, mathematician, and I had discovered her through an art project, which is the dinner party, Judy Chicago's dinner party from way back in the 80s, which, by the way, is in Brooklyn Museum, so anybody who wants to go see it can go see it, and it's wonderful. It's huge. But I really wanted to tell her story. And as I was researching her story, I kept coming across all these other women from the same era that were doing really wonderful, interesting things. There was 3 women who ruled the Roman Empire. Selene was set in Alexandria because that's where Hypatia was. But but one of the women shows up because she's ruling for her brother in the East. So she shows up when she's regent, just kind of tangentially. But I kept running across all these women in history, and I said, why haven't I heard of these people? They were doing all these wonderful things. One ruled the West for years and years, one ruled the East, another was the Rebel Empress, which I'll talk more about. And that's what drew me to this time period. Initially, it was Hypatia, and then I just found all these other great women whose stories were not being told, and I wanted to tell them.
Fantastic. Radha, in the same way, you are also writing a series called the Kitty Weeks Mystery Series, and it's set here in New York City. How did you get involved in that era, and why in New York?
Well, so I did my PhD in silent cinema, American silent cinema, and the early 1910s are when women were very prominent in the industry, and that's what made me interested in that period. And it was really a transitional time for the country where like the U.S. went from being like a second-tier country really at the end of World War I. It was a major world power. And so the idea with these books was to see how that happened through the eyes of this character. So this series, though, is only 2 books. The next one, the publisher decided that I was like their first standalone, their first sort of mystery imprint, and then they sort of switched directions and as happens in publishing. So my new novel is set in New York City in the 1900s, but it's totally different. It's standalone, number 10 Dwyer Street. It's set, I don't know if you're familiar with Chinatown, but it's set in Dwyer Street in Chinatown, also based on real events. But it's the same period, the early 1900s and 1910s in the US. There was a lot of change going on.
Are they the same characters that are in the Kitty Weeks?
No, it's Kitty Weeks and then the number, and I can actually talk about that.
We'll talk about that as we get to it. That's fantastic. So one of the things I was researching in preparing for this was, how do you balance historical fiction with your writing? And there's a master class that was saying that there's a certain number of rules that you follow when you're writing a historical novel. And some of them were saying, be clear about your premise, remove your own personal self as an author away from the story, do your research, but be flexible with facts, okay? Decide if you need permission, combine stories, shift setting, edit extensively. Andrea, I want to run by you this idea of be flexible with facts. In these 8 steps by the master class, does that sound right to you, that that's kosher?
I think it can be kosher. I have worked with authors before who, because of the emotions and the themes that they want to express, they're like, it would be so much better if this had happened 30 days before it actually happened. And and we have a lot of discussions about that. I am personally of the belief that authors can do whatever they want. I do think that there should be an author's note at the end of the book that explains the liberties that they took, because I think that can be helpful for readers. Plus, it can also protect the author, because as someone who did work in publishing and got a lot of letters from armchair historians who like to write in with letters about all of the errors that they found in various historical novels, it also protects the author, because the author says, yes, I know this, I did my research, just wasn't 100% accurate, but I felt like for this aspect of the story, for this character, it really helped the narrative if we fudged it or we tweaked this. But so I always tell people, I want everyone to, I want them to have the artistic license, but also cover your butt at the end a little bit.
So Faith, I want to run by this by you, because you have such great history about these women rulers. Did you find that having flexible facts was essential in some places for you?
A little bit. I actually had more flexibility than other people who might be writing about folks in a more modern time and have access to diaries and letters and things of that nature, because I was writing in the 5th century. And it was a time of chaos, and so a lot of the actual primary sources were destroyed over time. And so I would have pretty much an outline of what we thought these people did, male, female, cross, battles and births and deaths, sometimes not even births and deaths, but, they could say circa, something. So I could, in some cases where there would be more than one story about, what this person did, the historians didn't agree. Some would say this and the next one would say the other. I would choose the one that fit my story better. Because it was biographical historical fiction, I did try to stick as close as I could to what was known. I didn't fudge much at all. And anything that I did, or anything where I was making choices, I always put in the author's note. But yeah, so, people who write in the 1800s or 1900s and have access to, a lot more research than I did, probably have to be a lot more careful about that than I did.
And Radha, I see that when you were writing your book, you had some access to materials. Did those materials inspire you, or was that the idea when you first started out that a front page affair was going to be the incident that you chose when you first started writing the book?
Well, so I use the newspapers of the day a lot, and for the front page affair, I think, if I remember correctly, I actually really lined up things that were happening almost day by day with the papers, because you can go to New York Times, you can look at the news and the headlines, and I really enjoyed doing that. With the new book, for instance, I wanted to it all takes place in the course of one summer. Similarly, these first two books have a pretty tight timeline. It all takes place, and it's all events that actually happen in the summer of 1907. But in order to set up the main character, it's about this gangster in Chinatown who really existed. There was like this very famous event, but that happened in 1905, and I was like, oh no. And then I thought, should I make up an event? And I said, that's crazy. I'm just going to collapse that one 1905 just to get the story rolling, because I didn't feel like it was cheating, because it was the kind of thing that people would have known about this guy. I just, for narrative reasons, collapsed it and made it like right happening then. But I did put a note in the end saying, just so you know, I know this event, this happened in 1905. Everything else happens in 1907. And then I really did use, in both books, I used the newspapers very actively. And in this new book, I actually, they're different newspaper reports, and they're all slightly contradictory, and you can see how the newspapers of the day like really take liberties with the facts. You read it and you're like, what exactly happened here? And so the main character is, I actually quote the papers, and part of it is she's trying to tell the story more clearly. So like my fictional version, I'm presenting as the real version, with the papers all contradicting each other regarding the truth.
Andrea, when you and I work together, my book, it has a little bit of historical fact, but it's also visionary. So I went really off the rails in terms of sticking to historical fiction. And when we worked together, you encouraged me to rewrite the end, because you felt that the chapters weren't driving towards the nemesis POV. In a historical fiction, is that something you typically recommend too, if the facts aren't leading up to a dynamic beginning, middle, and end?
I think a lot of times authors, especially when they've been working on a book for a really long time, certain things become fixed in your minds that are actually not fixed, because you can do whatever you want. And as an editor, sometimes my job is to basically say, well, what if you did this? Or what if you inserted this person's point of view? Like if we're struggling to get the information across and you have several characters already, why not, go into someone else's head who can get eyes where you want them to be. And so a lot of times, especially with developmental editing, especially when I'm working with authors who have been working on projects for a while, I always tell people that I'm just throwing spaghetti at your brain, basically, to see what sticks. Because sometimes someone's saying, you don't have to do it this way. You don't have to stick to this person's point of view in this section. Or a crazy idea, you could collapse these chapters or combine two characters that you've created into one character who would do everything that you want them to do, but better and more streamlined. And I think that is mainly an editor's job, is to just throw things out there and see what that sparks with the author, and to create new solutions. Because I have written myself, and I know how easy it is the more you work on something, the more there's a tunnel. And it's like, no, it has to be this way. It's always started here. This has always happened on page 100. Like this character has always been a side character. And you're like, it doesn't have to be. Like it's up to you. You have all the power, really. You can do whatever you want.
That's crazy talk.
I know. And a lot of times I feel like the best edits or the things that make people feel very excited about their projects again come from those conversations.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
Radha, in a front page affair, which is based on some true events, there were some fantastic uses of settings, period expressions, and habits. And in the back of your book, you wrote that you read the New York Times each day from Morgan's shooting to Dr. Albert leaving his briefcase on the train. How did you know to resource the New York Times in terms of the timeline for this event?
As opposed to a different paper?
Yeah.
That's a good, I think because the New York Times, I consider it like the paper of record, and at the time when I was doing the research, it was one of the few papers that was like fully digitized and easy for me to search. Now there's so many more, and Library of Congress has a newspaper archive that's really great, so you can now really access a whole world of newspapers by searching by keyword. But I always just find it fun, and then as you look through the pages, you see other like random things happening, advertisements, all of these kind of things that will just give you so many ideas for just the whole milieu and what's happening.
So before you started researching, did you know your plot line, or did the research prompt different courses of action once you discovered them?
I think it prompted different courses of action for that book, and the new book is also pretty much like what happens in the book is what happened historically, even though I know that, yeah, I think some people might have chosen to say like, okay, I really like the advice you're offering about like combining characters and stuff, but sometimes I feel like history is more crazy than fiction. So, and then I like to try to stick to it, but then sometimes it even feels like you're making this up, but no, it's actually what really happened. So.
I found it more than once in editorial letters. I've said, yeah, but I feel like this is kind of a stretch to believe, and they're like, no, that's 100% true. It's always the things where you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they're like, no, I can give you like 40 sources that say that this happened this way.
And Faith, in Rebel Empress, when you're talking about your lead, who is it pronounced Athenaeus? Athenaeus, thank you. She was the poet and the patron of Jerusalem, but she's called the Rebel Empress. Can you tell us why you came up and how you came up with this title for this third book?
Yeah, coming up with the third title was actually pretty hard. My first two was Dawn Empress, because the woman who is featured in that ruled the Western Empire. It was Twilight Empress, because she ruled the Western Empire just before Rome, the western side, fell. Dawn Empress was the second one, and the woman who was ruling that was Pulcheria, who was, she set the foundation for the Byzantine Empire. Then Athenaeus, who was married to the brother of the Dawn Empress, was kind of a homebody. She was a poet, she was an introverted writer, and she basically was there to give Theodosius, her husband, an heir. That old story, that's what the woman is there for. But she was her own person, even though she kind of got overshadowed originally. And so I kept trying to think, okay, should it be Poet Empress? Should it be, something else? Sister Empress, and I kept going through it. And as I was reading through my research, there was a sentence, and I actually use it as the epigraph at the beginning of the book, where the historian was talking about something that was happening in Jerusalem when Athenaeus was there. And he said what these religious people were doing. He says this was actually a rebellion, and it was even more of a rebellion because it was sanctioned by the Empress, who had become a rebel and I've now forgotten the date, where he considered her to have become a rebel. And I thought, oh, that's my hook. That's my hook. And when I went back and read, like all the stuff that she'd done, because I feel like my job was to come up with a character who could plausibly have done all the things that history said she did. And there's 35 years of history in there, and I have to pick and choose. So I use that to help me pick and choose. When was she a rebel? When did this show up where she was doing something that was against the rules or against her husband or whatever? And that ended up being my hook. And I was very pleased with the title after that. It took me a while.
So, Radha, I just want to jump to you real quick in terms of your book title, A Front Page Affair. You talk a little bit about the sexism of the day, where your protagonist is trying to come up through the journalism ideas, and that women weren't suited for work. Yeah. I was so surprised about the stress that they said women suffered from by being working women, displaced ovaries, collapsed uterus, depletion of the nerves. How did you incorporate this prejudice in your book? Was it something that you knew you were going to start off with as you started writing it?
I mean, I didn't know for sure, but what I did know was that I wanted to make it, I didn't want to make it anachronistic, so I didn't want to just pretend like, oh, it's fine, or like just have a little bit of like, yes, people, wondered about working women. I mean, there were, and actually it's like a very central part in Murder Between the Lines. The young girl who dies is right at the beginning of the novel. She's a sleepwalker and she's a student, and I think that I got that also from the New York Times, from this story, and then it's like girl somnambulist dies in snow or something, and they said, oh, she died because she studied too hard and like it addled her brain, and that's why she died, and that's what it was. And I just feel like those types of things, when you're writing historical fiction, like they're so, I don't even necessarily want to debunk them fully, because I feel like whatever diagnoses we have today, like in 50 years, someone's going to be like, that's crazy, or in 20 years. But I like to incorporate them into the book, and like those would have been very real things, like real ways to think about what was happening to women at the time. I mean, obviously, in the novel, there's another reason that's found, but it's not like, oh, you're crazy to think that.
And Andrea, when you edit a historical book that brings in an aspect of something, and say that it's really controversial with its drug use or whatever, and you feel that that's overshadowing part of the plot, how do you weave that back into a character-driven book?
I mean, I have a lot of conversations with my authors about whether certain things are necessary. Like, do you feel like it encourages, does your character need to experience this? Does your character need to confront it? Does your character need to figure out how to maneuver around it? I mean, I think, do you need this in order to create an accurate picture of the world that your character grew up in, so that you understand the mindset? Like, I work with a lot of authors who are very nervous about including certain things or not. And I said, I think at the end of the day, if you feel like it needs to be in there, then you keep it in there. But if you feel like it's something, again, I really think it all comes back to character and like what you're trying to do, whether you're working with a solo character or a multi-character cast. It's all about, what do you need them to see? What do you need them to experience? What do you need readers to understand about the context that they're living in, so that that they understand what their mindset is going into everything that they face?
Well, that's a great perspective, because Faith, in your novel, I mean, we're talking civilizations and generals and empresses. When you were writing that with all your research, how the whole idea with your main character is that she had a religious belief that was not popular, that Christ only had one nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, the monophysites, yeah.
And all these other people had these different ideas from the church, that Christ had two natures. He was divine and human. Mm-hmm. And would you say, when you were trying to cast all these characters that had these different things, how did you winnow that down?
Yeah, that was a very difficult task, because we're talking about the 400s here. So Christianity had only been around for a couple centuries. It had gone through many, many changes. If you do any historical work, you really wonder where the Bible came from. But there was just, they were constantly coming up with, this is now you're a heretic because you believe in just one nature of Christ. And then a new emperor would come in and say, well, I believe there's two. So the emperor would put his stamp on what it is, and it went on and on like that, and back and forth, and it was constantly changing, and a lot of politics. There was, you could not separate church and state, because the emperors were very much involved in using the church to control their people. And it's a really, really complicated system. So trying to simplify that, because people have in the past written volumes and volumes and volumes on this stuff. So again, you had to do it through character. And it was known that Athenaeus when she actually rebelled against her husband and ended up leaving Constantinople and moving to Jerusalem. But it wasn't for religion. That was a whole nother thing. Supposedly she committed adultery, but we don't know that either, one way or the other. But that's why she left, supposedly. And so while she was there, her husband and her sister-in-law, the Dawn Empress, believed in the dual nature of Christ. And in my fiction, I have her rebelling against that because she's actually rebelling against them and not necessarily against the church. I don't know. The historians don't know. But that's where I came down on it, because it made it simpler than to try to come up with a whole philosophy and religion around that.
And she was somewhat considered a pagan in the beginning of the books.
Yes. She was not baptized in the Christian church, which was the Nicene church at the time. Her father had not been, and he had held a chair in rhetoric at the Athens Academy, and had educated his daughter. And she considered herself a philosopher. And the philosophers of the time held many different beliefs as well, but one of the key ones, and this was also true with Hypatia, my philosopher in Alexandria, was that there was a creative force that created the world and then basically kind of left it to go its own way. Some philosophers felt that you could get to know this creative force, or God as they wanted to call it, but they were not polytheistic. They didn't believe in Juno and Apollo and all those gods. They believed in a creative force. I like to think that creative force was female, but they don't say one way or the other. It's just a creative force.
And Radha, in your book, your Kitty Weeks, and her real name is Capability, is that right? She's very educated as well. Was it hard to find ways to find a woman in 1915 who had had a proper education in New York City?
No, because actually I think where people don't realize is that women were making huge strides at that stage, and actually at the turn of the 19th century, women were starting to enroll in higher education programs and stuff. In some schools, actually, in numbers that outnumbered men. They were starting to take over, and that's when you started getting the development of things like home economics and classes like that, so you could just push women off into a different lane, so to speak, so that they weren't directly competing with men. And I think that that's something that people don't actually realize, in terms of women's progress. There was a lot of progress at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and then for professional women, it drops off in the 20s, and you don't see it come back again until the women's movement of the 70s. So, obviously, most Kitty has a high school education and things like that, but the idea of being an educated woman it's not the way it is now, but it's certainly not an unknown.
It's just so great to read both your novels and see these two women who are very intelligent, totally underestimated by the population about whether they should be in charge, and yet they both beat the odds in terms of being smart enough to come up against the patriarchy, which I loved. That was great. So Andrea, in starting to understand about what a developmental editor does, can you tell us when an author gives you a book, do you decide to take on the book according to the genre of fiction, or is it just whatever the compelling story is that you would like to work on?
I read very widely and very many genres. And when I worked at Penguin Random House, I worked at what was the hub of Knopf Doubleday and Pantheon, which, if you know anything about those imprints, they publish wildly different books. Knopf does very literary, Doubleday would do the very commercial, Pantheon would do fairly literary, but a little bit, quirky, a little bit more out of bounds. So I personally like the surprise of working on novels of all different genres. I would say there's not a lot that I don't work on. I will tell authors, if they come to me and I feel like I'm not the right fit just because, I don't have an interest in the subject, or I feel, it's sometimes very hard speculative fiction or very hard sci-fi. I feel like I haven't read enough in the category. I always say, I can weigh in on it in terms of story, but especially for authors who are looking to publish traditionally, I don't know the market for that as well because I don't read as widely in that. So there's very little that I say I'm not interested in working on. And again, sometimes I think, especially at the early stage of developmental editing, it can be helpful to have someone who might not be, a certain genre's like number one reader, because it can give feedback occasionally that breaks out of certain molds or certain areas that they're stuck on, or certain ways to approach like various plot points or problems.
What would you say is the ultimate defining aspect of being a developmental editor? I mean, how do you develop a book in terms of editing it with someone?
When I get a manuscript, and especially when I get a manuscript in an early stage, like I always do a read first as a reader. Like I print it all out and I sit with it as closely as it would be if I were holding a book in my hands. And as I go, I make a lot of different notes for myself, like places where I either felt like I lost my connection to the character, I felt confused, I felt that, or I felt like I started to feel the momentum sag a little bit. I'm very upfront with my authors in my initial note to just say this was my reading experience, like this, all with the understanding that I am one reader and all reads are subjective. But a lot of times authors don't have that type of deep conversation with their readers. Like the readers won't sit there and give them a play-by-play. I give them a play-by-play and say, I was really into this. You lost me a little bit here. I snapped back here, had a lot of questions. I was, upset that so-and-so didn't get his just desserts at the end. I just tell them my experience as a reader. And then I examine it, I go back and I do another read on the computer where I leave people so many notes in the margins that I often have phone calls before they get them, just to say, hey, listen to my voice, it's very friendly. It's going to be talking to you a lot in the margins. I just want you to remember what it sounds like when every page has 20 bubble comments on it that are saying, I don't know if this makes sense, or something like that. Because I do want authors to know that I am on their side, and that me asking tons of questions is just like the process so that they can see what's working and not working. With historical fiction especially, I make a point too. I feel like I have a good general knowledge of history, but a lot of times the authors obviously, they're experts in their field. They know so much more. I will make a point not to go and read up too much on the subject until I've read the novel, because I think it's very important for me to be the person who says, I'm lost here, or I'm not quite understanding this, what happened, because I think it can give authors a good idea of what questions readers would be asking. Like, do they need to put in more context about this so that a reader who possibly, doesn't know the specific dates that certain things happen, that don't know, the exact escalating causes of World War II or something. Like, I feel like, that's my job, is to be the voice of the reader. Like most readers, you don't have that kind of conversation with them. So I go through that way and give them tons of feedback. But again, I always tell people, developmental editor is on your side all the time, even though it doesn't feel like it. And my job is to be someone that you can ask a million questions. I encourage people when they send me their manuscript to work on, I always like them to send a separate document that it's a do not open until you finish reading document, where they have all of their questions that they want me to answer. That way I have a blind read of the book, so I know how I feel about the book. And then I can go into their questions and say, oh, I agree with you here. This thing that you're worried about, here are some ideas that I think, we can work on. Sometimes authors are worried about things that personally, again, I'm just one reader, but I was like, I don't think that that's a problem. And they're like, that's their number one concern. I was like, that is not an issue or a concern that I ever had. And it's a good way for them to use me as a way to gauge like all of those questions that sort of haunt you as you're, writing alone often with your computer, is just to have, sign of a friend in the trenches.
Well, speaking of a friend in the trenches, Radha, I'd love to know, did you have like people in journalism and newspapers help you give the background about how a newspaper was operating at that time? Because I thought that you entered the world of writing for a newspaper so well. How did you get that incorporated into your novel?
Well, before I answer that, I just wanted to say I think you sound like a great editor.
Oh.
Everything you said makes so much sense to me, and what you were saying about encouraging people to I think it takes so much work to be able to say, yeah, put these two characters into one, or think about this differently and make these shifts. I think that's such helpful advice.
Thank you.
So, sounds wonderful. So in terms of the journalism world, I had actually read this really wonderful E.L. Doctorow book, The Waterworks, which is set in journalism a little bit earlier in the 19th century, which had made a big impact on me. But then also I used things like I love to read career guides and manuals and all of these type of advice type of things, which they just generated so much of in the beginning of the 20th century. So that's where I got a lot of. And then I read, I probably did too much research, but I read about, there were academic books written about women in the industry and women journalists and things like that. It was a little bit of an off the beaten path career for women, but there were definitely women journalists making their mark. So,
did you have a beta reader that was in journalism to read your book as you went along? I just thought it sounded so authentic.
Oh, thanks. No, I didn't. Also because I don't think that what journalism is like today. Who knows? I don't know if it's the same thing. But no, I didn't.
But I thought the divisions of the circulation, the administration, the city desk, all that stuff, it just really sounded fabulous.
Thank you.
And Faith, talking to you about your genre, in terms of understanding the different hierarchies within not only the political, but the religious aspects, they were both such complicated worlds. Did you have an editor or an expert help advise you on how to break down all those stratas?
I didn't. It was just something that I kept going back to, the character. So the character was my driving force, and I have learned, having written several of these kinds of books over time, where to combine characters, and I will say in my note, say, okay, this character represents the 15 different courtiers that you might run across in court, and this woman who is a servant is filling in for a multitude of servants that an empress would have, as an empress. So I tended to just do that because I couldn't include everything. So, it was really just a matter of survival to, to start combining people and simplifying the history. And, so, there might have been 5 wars, and I talk about one.
I just have to know, the one character that was devoted to her towards the end, was that based on a real person?
Which character?
The one who goes to Jerusalem with her and protects her and is the best friend.
Are you talking about male or female?
Male, yeah.
Oh, yeah, her captain of the guards. Yes. He was totally fictional.
Oh, no.
Yes, he was.
That is it was just so compelling because I kept going,
I loved him. He was a sweetheart. But he was totally fictional.
So, Radha, I just have to know, your research for the Sleepy Hollow Country Club that belonged to the Vanderbilt daughter was just so vividly drawn. Did you actually visit the estate?
I've driven past it. I don't think you can go in unless you're a member. But when you read these newspaper descriptions and stuff, you get a very good sense of the place. And I do think that this advice, someone gave it to me, and I think that's correct. It's I feel like if you do enough research, then at a certain point you start having to make guesses, or you would go crazy trying to verify everything. And I think generally the guesses you make are close to they're appropriate for the place, even if they may not be 100% correct. But for instance, like the Kitty's apartment where she lives, that's a real building on West End Avenue, and like I had seen the floor plans for those apartments and things like that, or like one of the clubs, I think it's in the second book, the Century Club, I think, which is still there on Fifth Avenue, that you can't go in unless you're a member, but they're pretty elaborate descriptions inside, and then at a certain point you feel like, okay, I think I've done all the research I can do. I mean, because you have to allow yourself the freedom to like assume at some level you've kind of internalized it, you have to forget it, and then just start writing. Otherwise it would be impossibly hard, I think.
So Faith, I just have a question here about one of the plot points is that your protagonist asked her husband, the ruler, to gift a number of chairs to the Constantinople University, and they created this Theodosian code. What is that code, and how does it factor in our discussion about fact or fiction and historical fiction?
Yeah, well, the Theodosian Code was a real thing back again in this time. There had been many, many emperors, and they all produced what they called constitutions. Those were laws. And there were many overlapping and contradictory ones. And Theodosius II, his signature accomplishment in history, what he is actually known for, is that he brought together all these various and conflicting laws into a single code. So in my fiction, I have the idea of Athenaeus, because she did indeed ask him to endow a bunch of chairs at Constantinople, because she was from Athens, which had a really great university, and she comes to Constantinople and she says, this is pathetic. This university isn't up to snuff when it comes to being at the center of the universe. So when she gets the opportunity, she whispers in his ear, it's pillow talk, he says, so what would you like as a gift? And she says, I want you to endow 30 chairs at the university. Again, that's the history part. And then she says, I know that your sister, Empress, you won't like that because she just wants to build churches. So here's the reason why this would be a good thing for you. You know that all those contradictory laws that you've been complaining about over time, these scholars can help you make a code. Wouldn't that be nice, sweetie? And so that's how that happened. But that is what he's known for. In my fiction, I have it because she whispered in his ear, and because she really wanted to improve education all across the board.
So, and it was somewhat named after him then?
Yeah,
right?
oh, it's always named after the guy.
I see.
Yeah.
And Radha, I was going to ask you, one of your plots has an actress who wants to become sort of legitimate. Did you research a lot of what the stage shows were and what her career could have been like during that time in New York City?
Well, I had done, my academic work is in women in silent cinema, so luckily that was one thing I didn't need to research. But again, the women actresses were it was like such a career for women where they were really making a lot of money, and that was the time where you had actresses like Mary Pickford who were fabulously wealthy by any standards, and it was like one of these few careers where women could make a lot of money. So that's where that came from. But I also just wanted to say, in terms of doing research, I think that you can find these beautiful nuggets, and often like my absolute favorite things, you realize they just can't be in the book, and I think having someone tell you, or like having the courage to be like, okay, I really like that, but it has no place in the book. And one example is, now I don't even remember clearly, but Kitty sees a car parked across the street, and it has I was like, oh, did cars have license plates back then? Would she have seen a license plate? So then I went and I looked at, automobile directories from the period. And in fact, they did have license plates. So then I was like, oh, well, how would you know who the car belonged to? Well, there was something called an automobile, like a phone book. And it was simply the car license plate numbers written in order numerically with the owner's name and their address and the make of their car, so you could just look it up. And there's like one was, I remember, like it was all just like one of the Vanderbilts, and the address was simply Grand Central Station, and it was just like car, and it was so fantastic, and I wanted to put it, but it had no room, so I always just tell that story. And so just like remember that if there's something that you like, but it can be as wonderful a little factoid, but if it's not fitting with the story, you just have to let it go and then save it for an occasion like this.
I think Mike Nichols, when he's doing a film, he always says you have to kill your babies because sometimes you populate them with all these things. We're going to have one more question for Andrea, and then if there are questions in the audience, we can take those. But in closing, Andrea, I wanted to ask, what would you say, if you were to estimate the percentage of fact versus fiction in a good historical novel, what would you say that is, or is a percentage not even part of the picture?
I don't like to put percentage. I don't like to put rules on novels because I feel like every time you do that, then an author will write a novel that breaks every single rule you said and it works beautifully, and then you look silly to say, well, you can't do this. I generally, in writing historical fiction, I do think like 50-50 is a good thing to look at, to say, here like 50% is just like a story of a human person, no matter where they're living, what do they want? Like, how are they going to get it? What are they going to learn? Who are they going to encounter? Like, how are they going to change? Like, all of those questions are about 50%. And then the historical aspect when you're writing historical novel is also about 50%, because so much of the history is going to answer those questions that you have for your character.
Well, thank you for committing to 50-50.
I'll commit to 50-50. But then I was like, if you look also, I was thinking about this question like when I was driving in today and thinking like, if I say, oh, it should be less than 50-50, then we're going to talk about, you look at Tolstoy and people who are like, I'm going to write like 100 pages about wheat threshing, like in Russia at the time, and I'm like, people could argue that that is not important to the book, but obviously it has stood the test of time. So I don't want to put any labels on it. He got away with it. And people looking at it now would say, I don't know if this is relevant.
Break the rules.
Yeah.
So do we have any questions for our panelists? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, for further to Radha's last point, if in late stage research, when you're following up on something, you come across an historical fact or some story that you say, wow, this would really change things. How have you run across that, and would you go back and rewrite major sections of your work? And this is mostly for Radha and Faith, but I guess, Andrea, I would ask you, if you see that kind of tangent occurring in a draft, how would you treat it?
All right, so the question for everyone is, if you see a very important historical course of action happen, do you have to put it in there exactly as it happens, would you say?
Do you have to, or you think it would really change and enhance the story that you're trying to tell?
So if there's a major course of action during the time of your novel, do you think it's essential to put it into your book? Radha, why don't we start with you?
I think that if you thought it would enhance your book, then maybe you need to go back. I feel like if you've done your research thoroughly, like, not that you wouldn't find something that would surprise you and make you have to rewrite it, but that if you found some fact, like for instance, with this new book, there's like this whole set of things that supposedly happened, and then I went to like where it should have been recorded that they did happen, and I was like, oh, it was supposed to happen in this meeting, and I see no record of it happening. So what happened there? And I kind of incorporated the fact that, it's hard to explain, but I incorporated the fact that like it didn't happen the way it was supposed to have happened. I incorporated that into the book, but it didn't go back and retrospectively change everything. So, like, I don't know what it, I think if you've thought over your piece thoroughly, like even if there was like some bolt out of the blue, it shouldn't shift everything. Like you would probably find a way to even say like, oh, this is a bolt out of the blue, and make that a part of your story, not like make you have to change the whole story, if that makes sense.
And Andrea, what is your take on that?
If an author came to me, if we were working together in several drafts and said, I had this wonderful idea, or I discovered this piece of information that I feel like I really need to work into the book, like my job is not to say, no, you shouldn't do that, but my job, because I do believe authors should follow the inspiration that hits them, especially if it's something that they're really excited about. But my job is to talk it through with them and say, okay, but if you do this, like, here are all of the dominoes that are going to happen. Here are all the things that are going to have to change. By adding this, are you going to be taking away from this other thing that has been working really well in your book? Is there a way to balance those two things? And sometimes after talking through changes like that, the author will still be say, okay, I want to do it. And we've mapped out the course. Sometimes after talking through, they realize that like what they're going to have to change and what they're going to have to take away from the book in order to follow this new path is actually going to hurt all of the good work that they've already done. And so they say, okay, I'm going to save that for another book. I'm a big proponent of saying things that you have to take out. I'm like, let's use that as like the germ of another book project somehow, or use it as a fun anecdote when you're doing panels, or write an article about it, or use it as promotional material for the book. Like, it doesn't have to die. It can also be used in many other ways.
And Faith, you had so many incidences happening during the course of that book. How did you pick and choose?
Again, I picked the incidents that would build my character. Yeah, but again, I have had a few opportunities to change things. Like in my first book, Twilight Empress, I had written the whole thing. It was pretty much done, and I got a new paper that basically it changed a detail. My character was buried in Rome. I had thought she was buried in Ravenna. The Empress's name is Galla Placidia, and in Ravenna there is Galla Placidia's mausoleum, which you would think would mean that she was buried there. And in fact, all the tourist information that I gathered when I visited said she was buried there. But the researchers had basically said, nah, she was buried in Rome, and gave all the reasons why. So that meant that I had to go back. I hadn't published yet, so I got the opportunity to go back and change the details. So instead of her in the epilogue where she has her dying scene, it is now in Rome rather than in Ravenna. And and I'd set up a couple little details earlier to say that Rome was her favorite city, and she would want to go there because her first child was buried there, and blah blah blah. So it was a matter of detail, but it did, when I found it, I said, I have to change this. So that was, if it had already been published, but it hadn't. So I went back and I did change it. And then I said, in my author's note, so all of you who think that Galla Placidia's mausoleum in Ravenna, was her resting place, no, it isn't, and here's why. So.
Do we have some other questions? Yes, Loretta?
I guess this is a question for everybody, but I think first Andrea. By the way, thank you. It's been a wonderful talk. How do you approach, let's say, a character from the 19th century who's a main character who will reflect, say, racist attitudes of the time?
Okay, so we're going to restate that. Andrea, how would you approach a character from the 19th century who's reflecting the racist attitudes of the time in the writing?
To balance authenticity with, the capacity to empathize with somebody,
I think it's really tricky. And this is a conversation I have with my authors all of the time. And we talk a long time about, again, is this necessary? Is this, to understand the character, do we need to understand this facet of them? A lot of times the answer is yes. I also encourage my authors, though, like I am a white person, and I don't all have the answers also about how other readers, especially readers who might have been on the brunt of that form of racism, are going to experience the book. So I do always recommend to my authors, if you're very concerned about this, I would recommend working with a sensitivity reader who honestly has much more experience at this in this area too, about how to balance that. I then, after my authors have a sensitivity read, we often go over the notes and we talk about them, going through to say, okay, I think this is a really good point, and the sensitivity reader also always has good insight, because they've worked on a lot of other books in a similar ways about how publishing as a whole is handling that. So that's usually my advice with my authors, is we have a conversation first, then we do find someone who can weigh in with more authenticity and with more experience, and then we go over those notes together.
Great. Do we have another question? Yes.
Hi. I just wrote my first historical fiction novel, so I'm a beginner, even though I did research this for 20 years.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions, and I'm writing about a very famous person, but showing them in a very different light that hasn't been revealed before. I just wanted to know if I broke rules by 95% of the characters in the book were real, but I did invent a couple of characters, and I just want to make sure that's not a rule breaking. The other thing I did was there were some letters written by the protagonist, and I put her in scenes talking to other people, actually saying the words from the letters. So she never really had those conversations with those people, but those were her words. And I did shift one or two little dates, not by a lot.
So just to recap for the taping, your question is, you're taking a letter and you're using that as conversation, right? And if that's correct, and then what was the other question?
That I created a couple of fictional
Right,
characters.
and that there's fictional characters.
Blended them into
That's
Yes.
it's
real
absolutely.
characters.
What do you think
From
about
my
that?
viewpoint, yes. I absolutely. Okay, I think that I find it hard pressed sometimes to think of a historical novel that doesn't have a few invented characters a lot of times, or at least characters that are, 90% the author's creation, that they've designed around a footnote. So I wouldn't, I honestly think that, that's a tool that a lot of authors
Well, and
use.
you've broken my heart, Faith, by saying that person was made up. What about Radha? Did you invent some characters in your book too, as well as the historical people?
Yeah, in a front page of Fear and Murder, between the line only I can't remember the ratio, but a lot of the secondary characters are made up, and obviously the protagonist is made up. And in the new book, actually most of the characters are historical. But I wanted to say one thing that I learned and doing this new book was that, so it's set in Chinatown with a Chinese gangster, and it's a real story of what happened to him. And as I was writing this book, I kept struggling, what perspective can I tell this story? I didn't want to do third person because I felt like I really just didn't have access into be able to describing without any filter, the life of a Chinese gangster, particularly in the early 1900s. And so I struggled, and I knew I needed a narrator. And when I wrote these Kitty Weeks books, which are set in the teens, I thought, can I make her an Indian woman? I was like, no way, there would be no Indian woman in New York City at the time. I can't do that. So Kitty is white, but she has a similar background to me. She lives abroad and she comes. So I tried to get that done, those type of similarities in. But for this book, I was like, what am I going to do? And I don't want to, again, sort of ventriloquize my thoughts through a character of a different race, ethnicity, gender. I'm really tired. And it took me a long time to write this book because I couldn't figure out that problem. And then finally, I think 3 years into it, I was just said, okay, New York City had 2 million people there's like a lot, it's a port city, there's a lot of movement between London, all these port cities have a lot of movement between them. I'm gonna just make a guess that there was one Indian woman there out of all those 2 million people, and she's gonna tell this story. And the minute I did that, I just like, actually, I spoke to my mom and I put it into, my mom is a historian, I was like, you know, and I was like, you know what, this is what I did, and I felt really bashful about it, and she was like, oh sure, there were Indian women in the 19th century in America, and then it was like all you had to do is type it into Google, and there they pop up, you know, and I had not imagined it, so I had not even thought of asking the question. And so sometimes like you're imagining, and not only were they there, they had written about what they saw in America, they were very like talented, educated women who came. So sometimes your research can only carry you so far. Sometimes you have to like really make this leap of imagination, and then you find out that actually history will bear you out, and wherever you find one, you always find more. So I don't know what my big takeaway is, but I think the idea that history is actually stranger than fiction, you know, I think it's our own imaginations that limit us sometimes when it comes to these things. So,
well, on that beautiful note, I'd like to say that the author's books are for sale here on the table. You can talk to them about buying them afterwards. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for our wonderful panelists.
That concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society at our website, or contact us at info@hnsnyc.org. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites in the description. Thanks for joining us.